Good morning, everybody. We're going to be looking at a passage in John chapter 10 and going to kind of continue the theme of looking at some of the parables. What we're going to look at today, if I were to put a title on this, would be The Good Shepherd. Prior to starting putting everything down to pen and paper, I wanted to kind of put down what I knew of shepherding sheep, shepherds. I don't know a whole lot going into this, did not know a whole lot going into this, as far as from the non-scriptural end of things. Pretty much the majority of what I know about sheep can be derived from the movie Babe, about a pig that wants to be a shepherd. One of my all-time favorite movies that I've watched with the kids numerous times. When I was a kid, growing up, going to the fair, and now I do this with my children as well, one of my favorite things to do would be to go to the where they have the animals, and I don't know what it's called, but just the area where they have all the stalls of the animals. My two favorite were to go to the pig aisle, or pig stalls, and see if we could make it through up one aisle, down the other, holding our breath and get out without catching a whiff of them. The second was the sheep, because the sheep were pretty stinky as well. And we were hearing earlier the verse that Caleb was talking about, wool being white as wool. One of the things I never understood was the concept of wool being white. If you've ever seen a sheep, they are not clean. That wool is not clean at all. It's a very coarse, fibrous material, and I don't understand how it gets so clean. I've got a coat with the wool inside of it. I'd like to say it's clean on the inside, but it collects stuff, and it's one of those things that wool is never that clean. From what I see with sheep are fairly not dirty animals, but their hair is very matted and unclean typically. The other thing was going through this is that a shepherd has a silent H in it, and if it wasn't for spell check, I would have had a pretty butchered set of notes here. The thing about shepherding, if you think about shepherds, you think about cowboys, and cowboys are kind of the shepherds of cows, I guess. And you think of a cowboy, and this is a really rugged, manly man. I mean, this is the guy that you look at, and that guy's got a swagger. He's a man's man. And I think of a shepherd, and this sounds bad, but the only picture I can conjure of a shepherd in my head is a Peruvian guy with those ponchos that are like the colored ponchos with the hat, walking the sheep. And that's the only image I could think of when I was thinking of a shepherd was that image. And I don't know why that is, but I'm sure there's some manly shepherds out there, but that was the image I had stuck in my head. Now, none of that has anything to do with what we're talking about. That's just for you knowing where I was coming from as far as shepherding. That's what I had going for me when I got into this. As far as the biblical end of things, shepherding sheep, shepherds, it's throughout the Bible. Genesis to Revelations, you've got, Psalms 23. You've got the picture of Christ as the shepherd. You've got the nativity scene. I mean, it's dotted throughout the scriptures. And there's great importance placed on the role of shepherding in the Bible. Like I mentioned in the Old Testament, you look at the genealogy of Christ. You've got Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. You've got the sons of Jacob. All 12, from what I could read, were all shepherds, Judah being one of those. You've got David as a shepherd. So that's 5 people as far as the ancestry of Christ that were all shepherds. Other notable shepherds would have been Moses. We've spoken of Lot. These guys were shepherds as well. And again, I don't think this was necessarily a romantic or a promising career necessarily. It wasn't something I think the people went to school to get their degrees in shepherding. But, shepherds were nomadic people. We've looked at Abraham and Lot in past sessions before. We've talked about, their travels. These were nomadic guys, and this wasn't particularly safe work. There were conflicts over land. You see that with Abraham and Lot's guys when they were arguing over the land they needed to graze their sheep. The story of Moses, when Moses took off and was running from the Egyptians, and he came to where the 7 daughters of Midian, the priest of Midian, were, and he chased off some shepherds that were trying to basically hog a water well that they were trying to water their sheep with. And Moses ended up marrying one of these, the daughters of Midian. There were a lot of wealthy shepherds in the Bible. Abraham and Lot, we've spoken of them before. Those guys were very wealthy individuals, but I don't think their wealth was necessarily tied directly to their shepherding skills, and that wasn't the only source of income these guys had. Looking at shepherding, again, going back to the idea of, as far as shepherding in skill, being a skill set, the only thing I can remember from the Bible as far as a shepherding skill set would have been the story of Jacob, where he was getting basically taken to the cleaner by Laban, because Laban kept marrying him off to different daughters and trapping him into, servitude, basically. And then Jacob made the deal with Laban as far as separating the spotted, I think, and the solid sheep or something along those lines. And he did something with a branch in the water. And anyways, that's not where I'm going with this, but that was a shepherding skill set from what I could see. King David was another shepherd, but he fought off a lion and a bear, if I remember correctly. But I don't know if that was a shepherding skill or more of a character trait for David. Now, that being said, I looked back at a couple different things about sheep and shepherding and shepherds in the Old Testament. One of the things that Warren Henderson stated, and you see this in a lot of his writings, is that the first instance you find of something in the Bible, whether it's the first use of a word or the first time that something is mentioned, it usually has great significance. The very first use of the word shepherd is the actual word is in Genesis 46:34, and you don't need to turn there, but this is the story of Joseph, and it's where he's talking to his brothers after they've been reunited. And in this passage, he states that, speaking to his brothers, he says, "You shall say, your servant's occupation has been with livestock from our youth, even till now, both we and also our fathers, that you may dwell in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians." Now, me and Kris were looking at this a little while back, and she actually emailed me some information on why this may have been. We don't know for sure why the shepherds specifically were considered abominations to the Egyptians. There's another passage earlier on where it speaks about how the Hebrews were an abomination to the Egyptians. But this specifically states the shepherds were an abomination to the Egyptians. One thought was that the Egyptians, until right before this had happened, had been ruled by a nomadic, or basically taken over by a nomadic culture that were the, I'll butcher it, by the Hyksos or something like that. They were the king shepherds, and these guys came in, they were a nomadic group. They came in and basically ruled Egypt and had been driven off by Amasis, which I believe was one of the pharaohs. The other may have been that the Hebrews ate and sacrificed animals that the Egyptians considered deity. Regardless, throughout the Old Testament, sheep are considered or seen as a means of a sacrifice. The first sacrifice that's mentioned in the Bible goes back to the idea of Abel. Abel, of course, being the very first shepherd. In Genesis 4:3 and actually 4:4, it talks about how God respected Abel and his offering. And it talks in 4:4 how Abel brought the firstborn of the flock and their fat, and how the Lord respected Abel and his offering. This is the first use of the word offering, and this is also the first shepherd, and the first shepherd was murdered. The story of Abraham and Isaac is the very first time that it speaks of God providing. And not necessarily that God didn't provide before this, but it's the first time where it actually speaks specifically as to God providing, and how God provided a male sheep, a ram, being provided by the Lord. In Genesis 31 is the first use of the word sacrifice, and it's implied here that Jacob is sacrificing a sheep because it talks about how he was with Laban in the hills with their flocks. So, we have these first instances. All these are first instances of different things relating to sheep, shepherds, shepherding. And these deal with murder, sacrifice, blood, the shepherds being considered an abomination. And shepherding from the Old Testament to the New Testament, again, like I stated, you find this all the way from Genesis through Revelation, the idea of sheep. It's carried through. The passage I want to look at today in John 10, verses 1 to 18. And I'll just read through this kind of quickly. But actually, before I get into that, let me backstory this really quickly. With the parables, one of the things I kind of like to look at is what led up to the actual parable, and what the kind of backstory was and who the audience was. And in this, in John 8:58, this is where Jesus had just kind of ducked out from the Judeans. In John 8:58, he had claimed his deity, and Jesus said to them, "I tell you the solemn truth, before Abraham came into existence, I am." And once he escaped from the Judeans who were coming to get him, at that point he came across a blind man, and he healed the blind man, gave him sight, and the Pharisees at that point went and questioned the blind man to find out who had healed him. And in John 9:28, and this is the Pharisees, they heaped insults, speaking to the blind man, on him, saying, "You are his disciple? We are disciples of Moses. We know God has spoken to Moses. We don't know where this man comes from." And the man replied, "This is a remarkable thing, that you don't know where he comes from, and yet he caused me to see. We know God doesn't listen to sinners, but if anyone is devout and does his will, God listens to him. Never before has anyone heard of someone causing a man born blind to see. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." And they replied, "You were born completely in sinfulness, and yet you presume to teach us." So they threw him out. So the Pharisees basically kicked this guy out, and then Jesus finds the man. And in chapter 9, verse 40, which is directly preceding to chapter 10, it talks about how Jesus found the man, and the man worshipped him. And some of the Pharisees who were with him heard this, who were with the blind man, heard this and asked him, "We are not blind too, are we?" And Jesus replied, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now because you claim you can see, your guilt remains." So the Pharisees are the crowd. These are the people that he's talking to in John 10, verses 1 to 18. And so if you want to read this with me, it says, "Most assuredly I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is a shepherd of the sheep. To him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And when he brings out his own sheep, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. Yet they will by no means follow a stranger, but will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers." Jesus used this illustration, but they did not understand the things which he spoke to them. Then Jesus said to them again, "Most assuredly I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who ever came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved, and he will go out and find pasture. The thief does not come except to steal and to kill and to destroy. I have come that they may have life, and that they have it more abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his own life for the sheep. But a hireling, he who is not the shepherd, one who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf catches the sheep and scatters them. The hireling flees because he is a hireling and does not care about the sheep. I am the good shepherd, and I know my sheep, and I am known by my own, and the Father knows me. Even so, I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And the other sheep I have, which are not of this fold, them also I must bring, and they will hear my voice, and there will be one flock and one shepherd." And actually, let me read through 18. "Therefore my Father loves me, because I lay down my life, and I may take it again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it up again. This command I've received from my Father." Now, in these verses, in his initial response here, when Jesus was talking in chapter 8:58, when he was talking to the Pharisees, he mentioned Abraham. And he was saying back in 8:58, "And I tell you the solemn truth, before Abraham came into existence, I am." Now, Abraham obviously would have been held in high esteem by the Pharisees and the ruling class at that time. In 9:28, when the Pharisees were speaking to the blind man, they invoked the name of Moses. They say that we are Moses' disciples. I find it interesting that both these individuals that are part of this story were both shepherds that were being mentioned by both Jesus and by the Pharisees. The little bit further backstory, even further back than just this, is why Jesus even used the reference of a shepherd. This goes back to the Old Testament. There's a couple of passages. The one I wanted to look at just briefly, and this is a big passage, so I'm just going to kind of pick some verses out of this, but it's in Ezekiel chapter 34. And this is the prophet Ezekiel speaking, and it's Ezekiel chapter 34, and it's going to be verses 1 through 31. I'm not going to read all these, I'm just going to pick a couple of verses. But the whole thing deals with this subject, but for just sake of brevity, I just want to go over a couple. Starting in verse 1. And the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, Thus says the Lord God of the shepherds, Woe to the shepherds of Israel who feed themselves. Should not the shepherds feed the flocks? You eat the fat and clothe yourselves with wool. You slaughter the fatlings, but you don't feed the flock. The weak you have not strengthened, nor have you healed those who were sick, nor bound the broken, nor brought back what was driven away, nor sought what was lost. But with force and cruelty you have ruled them. So they were scattered because there was no shepherd. Down in verse 7, Therefore you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, my sheep have become my prey, and have become food for the wild beast. There was no shepherd, and my shepherds did not search for my flock, but fed themselves and did not feed my sheep. Therefore I will demand my sheep. Therefore you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Look, I am against the shepherds, and I will demand my sheep from their hand. I will no longer let them be shepherds. The shepherds will not feed themselves anymore. I myself will search for my sheep and seek them out. And skipping down to verse 22, and it states, Therefore I will save my flock, and they shall no longer be prey, and I will judge between sheep and sheep, and I will establish one shepherd over them, and he shall feed them. My servant David, he shall feed them and be their shepherd. And I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David, a prince among them. Jeremiah 23 is another one that actually deals with this specifically as far as the idea of the sheep and the shepherds, and how the rulers of that time, the ones that were supposedly the spiritual leaders of God's chosen people, were not doing what was required of them. And in both cases, God's rebuking. And just to go back here quickly, it was Jeremiah 23, if I didn't mention that, as the other passage, if you want to look at that later. But he's speaking of a coming day in both instances when these shepherds will be judged and when God will gather to himself a scattered flock. In John 10, in verse 11, Jesus is claiming to be the promised shepherd. And by claiming to be the good shepherd, he is contrasting his shepherding to those that are currently watching the flock. And that would have been the audience he was speaking to, the Pharisees. And the only instance that I could find, Old Testament, New Testament period, as far as this phrase, good shepherd, was in John 10. And not only is Jesus claiming to be the promised shepherd here, but he's claiming by being this good shepherd that he is the one that is actually being kind of foretold in these prophecies that is coming to gather the people and to lead them. And it's a very stark contrast to the leaders of the time and what they were doing with these individuals. Looking back, at the passage earlier in 34 verses 2 and 3, you don't need to look back there, but it's very harsh imagery as far as what the prophet was speaking of. He was talking about, saying, Woe to the shepherds of Israel who feed themselves. Should not the shepherds feed the flocks? You eat the fat and clothe yourselves with the wool. You slaughter the fatlings, but you don't feed the flock. I mean, it's almost like a cannibalization of the people they were supposed to be watching, how they were just living off these people. And for the people listening, for these Pharisees that were listening, they would have caught the gist of what he was saying here. They were very well versed in the Old Testament prophets. And he wasn't mincing his words when he was saying, I'm the good shepherd. It was a very stark indictment of these individuals. And as far as shepherding, and like I said earlier, I know nothing about shepherding, but one of the things I was reading about as far as a shepherd's daily routine is how this whole first section of this speaks about the shepherd's routine. How these shepherds would each day bring their sheep at the end of the day into a shelter. these sheep would know the voice of their shepherd. And I know people have spoken on this much more eloquently than I can. So that's not where I want to go with what I'm talking about today. But, the sheep would know the voice of their shepherd. And a lot of times the sheep would actually be called by name by their shepherd. And, winter months, these sheep would have been brought into like a communal setting where they were brought into an area where they would have been, securely gated in, and there would have been that gate there where the shepherd would have been the one actually allowing them to go in or go out. And during the summer months, they would have gone out and grazed in the fields, and they would have been brought back, and they would have been watched by the shepherd in an enclosed area. And again, to go out to the pasture and to come in, this would have been something the shepherd would have allowed them to go in and out of. The shepherd would have been the door they had to pass through. And these guys were self-proclaimed disciples of Moses, the shepherds of Israel. And I think what Jesus was saying in these first couple of verses was pretty straightforward. If you want to look at verses 4 and 6 of chapter 10, I find these particularly interesting. And it states in verses 4 to 6, speaking of the shepherd, when he has brought out all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. A stranger they will not follow, and they will flee from him, for they don't know the voice of strangers. And this figure Jesus used with them, but they did not understand what he was saying. So Jesus is explaining to these guys that those that don't belong to the shepherd would not follow him. They would not recognize his voice. And the listeners here, the spiritual leaders, were hearing the good shepherd speak to them, and they didn't hear his voice, and they didn't understand him, and they didn't understand who he was or recognize his voice. So further down, Jesus kind of clarifies it, puts it, maybe translates it, not translates it, he kind of portrays it in a different light, I guess, for lack of a better word. In verses 7 to 10, he kind of talks about how he is the only way and means that mankind can access God and obtain salvation. He basically takes away the picture of it and puts it in black and white terms for them. And these verses are as plain as it gets. I mean, they're very, very clear. It wasn't abstract. He's not beating around the bush here. He's clearly stating that he is the only door to salvation. In verse 8, he talks about that all that come before me are thieves and robbers. And again, this is based on what we see in the Old Testament and how he's portraying this. He's referring to the spiritual leaders of the Jewish people at this time. And these are the individuals pretending to show the way of salvation to the people, but in fact, they're stealing from the people, clothing themselves with the fleece, and devouring the sheep. And there's a difference between thieves and robbers. A thief is somebody that's going to stealthily go in and take something and try and sneak back out with it. A robber is going to club you over the head and take something by force. And, if you look at Christ's crucifixion and, his accusers, which would have been the same group down the road, you see a lot of those characteristics, both those characteristics, in the individuals that wanted him to be crucified. And I think there's also something to be said for the stark contrast here as far as the ones that are listening, the hearers here, and the ones speaking. If you look at the preceding chapter and what I was speaking to as far as the things leading up to this, the Pharisees were very upset about the healing of a man that was born blind. If I remember this correctly, it was a Sabbath that he was healed on. That was the biggest part of it. But the thing that I got out of that was that the religious leaders didn't think of the Israelites as sheep. They thought of them as a ignorant, disgusting mob. And you can get that from John chapter 7, verse 49. And this is where the Jewish leaders are talking about the crowd gathering. And they're talking about how, and the verse John 7:49 states that, but this crowd does not know the law is accursed. And this fold, which would be the group of people that were destined to enter in the kingdom of God, was considered to be by the leaders kind of private club. And they were kind of the the membership committee. They considered themselves kind of the doorkeeper here to be accepted into this fold. They didn't have any compassion for this man that was born blind. To them, he was a complete write-off. And, he didn't cooperate. And when he went and point blank, pointed out the fallacies in what they were teaching and what they were telling him, or the inconsistency, I should say, in what they were teaching him, they put him out, is what it says, and put him out of the synagogue. And they weren't just putting him out of the synagogue, they were putting him out of the fold. They were essentially, I can't even remember the word, but when you kick somebody out of a church, whatever that is. Thank you. Excommunicating him, basically, cutting him off from the fold here. But Jesus, on the other hand, had just brought this man into the flock, and the man was brought into the flock not by something that he did, but by complete faith. And so, it's no wonder that Jesus is turning to the idea of shepherding here in chapter 10, and he's contrasting himself as the good shepherd with the Pharisees, the religious leaders, who were the evil shepherds. And these people were to be shepherding. But again, they were not. They were spiritually blindsiding the people they were supposed to be taking care of. They were stealing the spiritual life of the individuals they were supposed to be caretaking. But the contrast here again is how Christ came to give these people life, and he came to give it to them more abundantly and more freely, and it was at no cost to those individuals. The only price paid was paid by Christ on the cross. And as far as the Lord being a good shepherd, the Bible, again, is clear with references speaking of him being the shepherd, one that brings security and peace to his people. It talks about in Psalms 120 about the Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forever. Again, that idea of a gate going in and out from the to the pastures. One of the children's songs we were singing earlier, I Am the Door, speaks directly to this and the idea of shepherding as well. The idea of shepherds in the church, the idea of the eldership, and how it talks about the leaders of God's people, that they shall lead them out, bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord may not be as sheep which have no shepherd. That's Numbers 27:17. Just the idea of shepherding throughout. But again, the head shepherd, the chief shepherd here, is Christ, the good shepherd. And verses 11 on, the thing that I found most interesting in this passage, and the thing, again, we have the scriptures, we get the full picture of Christ's ministry on earth. We can read through the whole thing and understand how the whole picture fits together up to where we are at this point in time. But the disciples could spend the time with the Lord and not understand that he intended fully to lay his life down for the sheep. In these verses here, he's talking about verse 11, where he's talking about how the good shepherd will give his life for the sheep. And then down in 17 to 18, how he's stating clearly that he will lay down his life for the sheep, and that is his plan. And he's not talking figuratively as far as like risking or hazarding his life. He's talking literally about laying his life down for his sheep. And in verses 12 to 13, just to look at that, he talks about the hireling, and the hireling being one that would be paid to look after the sheep. And the thing about a hireling is the hireling is not going to be necessarily that vested in the welfare and the good of the sheep. That's not, he doesn't have ownership. That is something where he comes in, he does a job, and does it to the best of his ability. But there is not that sense of fellowship with the sheep. And the thing that I find so beautiful about this passage is that Christ is not only the shepherd, but he's the good shepherd. He is one that is fully vested in each and every one of us. And is something, obviously, to the point of death on the cross. And it's a very comforting thought. Intuitively, I think we come here Sundays. We know that Christ died for our sins. We know that he loves us. But the fact that he has a personal interest in me, that he is something beyond the hireling, that he is a shepherd that is completely devoted to me, is a very, very special and very, very heartening thought for me individually. The thing that kind of got me as I was thinking about this, and kind of a thought to leave you with, is the part where he talks about he knows his sheep, and his sheep know him. And I guess my question and my thought to leave with you is, how well do we know the Lord? How well do we know the shepherd? And how much time do we take to make the effort to get to know him better? I mentioned earlier the idea of sheep and shepherding all the way from Genesis through Revelation. One of the last instances of the sheep or shepherd found in the Bible is in Revelations 7:17, and it states, "For the Lamb who is in the midst of the throne will shepherd them and lead them to living fountains of water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes." And I just think that's a beautiful, beautiful picture of the shepherd that came to die for his sheep, and the idea that he is one of us, where he is actually the lamb as well, that is leading us as well as shepherding us, and that someday we will be able to be with him and be in perfect peace and harmony with him. Let's go ahead and just close with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we just come before you. We thank you for this opportunity we've had to be able to look at your words. We thank you for the Bible that you've given us. We thank you for the beautiful pictures that we can find in there of your love and your Son's love for us. We thank you for him being the good shepherd. We thank you for him laying his life down for us. We are nothing better than just sheep, Lord, that just don't know the way, don't know our own way. We thank you for giving us purpose, for giving us a hope, and giving us a promise. And we just pray for the time to come, Lord, just for Ishmael and the hour to come, and just for the time of fellowship ahead. In Jesus' name, amen.